From the hacking group Anonymous to individual pranksters and people with an agenda, here are the top 10 anonymous broadcast interruptions that exposed the government. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Anonymous. To start this list off today, we of course have to talk about the infamous hacking group known as Anonymous. Earlier this year, news was released that suggested that this group had hacked into different Russian-owned streaming services in order to interrupt their broadcast with their own message. It is said that they began playing footage of the ongoing war before cutting to a poem written by the Ukrainian singer Monotik. It is hard to know exactly how many programs were hijacked in this sort of situation, but according to a tweet sent out by the hacking group, they said that their hack targeted quote-unquote all of Russia's state-owned channels, and that this interruption was seen on all of them. In our number 9 spot today, we have the BBC. So for this one, we have to be on the same page on what a numbers station is. Basically, they are shortwave radio stations, and the transmissions or broadcasts are usually certain numbers or other repetitive things which are believed to be aimed to address intelligence officers who are operating in foreign countries. So for this story, we're taking it back to 1983 when the BBC, yes, the British Broadcasting Corporation, received a letter from a listener they had in Andorra. This listener had written into the World Service Waveguide program to complain that during her attempt at listening, she was interrupted by a female voice that was reading out numbers in English, and she wanted to know what this interference was. While the corporation gave a regular, non-sinister answer to the confused woman, after more research was done into the case, people aren't quite convinced. Many people who know much more about these things and recognize the patterns seen in numbers stations are fairly certain that this interruption was a numbers station that was being broadcast on a random frequency that just happened to intercept with this woman's BBC program. In our number 8 spot today, we have Southern Television. Back in November of 1977, residents of England who were watching the Southern Television broadcast were in for quite an eerie interruption. One peculiar evening, the night's news got interrupted and warped before the newscaster's voice was replaced by one that claimed to represent, quote, Ashtar Galactic Command. This voice explained that it was sending a message down to humanity, and the main point of the message was to tell humans to put down their weapons. This went on for about 6 minutes, and they claimed that our planet was in a new age, the age of Aquarius. Whoever this interruption came from must have just watched Hair or something. This new age, however, it was said that it could only be realized if, quote, rulers are made aware of the evil forces that can overshadow their judgments. The voice continued and finished off with, quote, may you be blessed by the supreme love and truth of the cosmos, and then the interruption was done. While this sure was a strange moment in time, viewers still have no idea who was responsible for this broadcast interruption. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Duga Radar. So for this one, we are talking about a huge missile defense radio structure called Duga 3. This structure is suspected of having been wildly over budget, and it was the source of many complaints after it was built. The systems were extremely powerful and broadcast in shortwave radio bands. They would appear without warning, and it sounded like a sharp, repetitive tapping noise, and they would disrupt things like legitimate broadcasts, amateur radio, commercial aviation communications, and utility transmissions, which all led to there being international complaints, and at the time, people didn't know what it was. This led people to think that this signal was actually being used for things like Soviet mind control or weather control experiments. In our number 6 spot today, we have Captain Midnight. On April 27th, 1986, a man named John McDougall, who was an electrical engineer and businessman, decided to jam the HBO satellite signal on Galaxy 1 during the broadcast of the film The Falcon and the Snowman. Of course, we now know who was responsible for the interruption, but at the time, John was anonymous, going by the pseudonym Captain Midnight. The 4.5-minute long interruption was essentially just Captain Midnight venting about the price and rates for HBO's satellite dish owners. He wanted to protest because he thought that it was too expensive. After his broadcast interruption, the FCC and FBI began investigating the incident. There was a tourist who gave a tip to the authorities after having overheard Captain Midnight using a payphone off of Interstate 75, and on this call, he was discussing the incident. There was a plea bargain that saw John receiving a $5,000 fine, 1 year unsupervised probation, and a 1-year suspension of his amateur radio license, but it also changed a lot when it came to laws around this sort of crime. The United States Congress passed the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, which made satellite hijacking a felony, and the automatic transmitter identification system system was also developed in response to this incident. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Channel 7 interruption. This strange and eerie interruption took place in 2007 during the airing of the documentary Mayday Head-On Collision, which was airing on Australia's Channel 7. Basically, the audio in the documentary was replaced by a looped voice message of an American saying, quote, "Jesus Christ, help us all, Lord, fuck." I'd say that's a pretty terrifying message to hear when you're just tuning into a documentary. Authorities may have found a true explanation for this one, but it doesn't seem to have been released publicly. Apparently the network just brushed it off, calling it a technical glitch due to an audio problem, but a lot of the people who witnessed it aren't so convinced. After the incident, there were hundreds of concerned Australians calling into the network looking for some kind of answers as to what exactly happened here and what they had all just watched. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Steve Wilkos interruption. About a decade ago, residents of a Montana suburb who were just chillin', relaxing, and watching an episode of the Steve Wilkos show were in for a rude interruption. During the broadcast, there was suddenly an emergency crawling across the screen. It claimed that the dead had risen from their graves and they were now roaming the streets, attacking the living. Yes, we are talking about a good old zombie apocalypse. The emergency alert claimed that people shouldn't try to apprehend the undead as they were dangerous individuals. Of course, we all know now that this was a hoax and that the town's emergency broadcasting system had been hacked by some unnamed source. This, however, wasn't the only one. Soon there were emergency broadcasts happening all over towns in Michigan with a similar story. One even interrupted Barney, of all programs. 2 of the stations at the time claimed that they tracked the hack overseas, but there hasn't been much word on anything else surrounding that. In our number 3 spot today, we have UVB 76. This sound apparently began to happen in the 1980s when a radio tower just north of Moscow began transmitting a random and seemingly bizarre assortment of beeps, but in 1992 the sound began to change. In that year, it suddenly switched to a buzzing sort of sound that would last about a second, and this sound would occur somewhere between 21 and 34 times every minute. This strange routine would be interrupted once every few weeks by a male voice, which would then be reciting a string of numbers and works, mostly Russian sounding names like Anna and Nikolai. The buzzing wasn't necessarily always exactly the same, as the tone would switch and there would be different intervals between the buzzes, but one thing that was always consistent is that every hour on the hour, the station would have 2 quick consecutive buzzes. To make things stranger, in June of 2010 and also in August of that year, the station briefly stopped sending out signals despite it having been constantly for years and years. At the end of August in 2010, the station again changed and there began to be different shuffling sounds and thuds that could be heard in the background, and often little snippets of the dance of the little swans from Swan Lake would also interrupt the broadcast. While we obviously know that these sounds are coming from a radio broadcast and we can make out some of the sounds we're hearing, we have absolutely no idea what purpose they serve, where they are coming from, or what they mean. Right now, the best guess is that these are secret messages that are being transmitted to secret agents, and if that's the case, it's likely that we'll never know exactly what is being discussed in these broadcasts. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Max Headroom Guy, probably the most famous broadcast interruption ever. On November 22nd, 1987, a man wearing a Max Headroom mask hijacked 2 separate television broadcasts in Chicago, Illinois. The man was basically speaking nonsense and moaning and screaming throughout, and the audio was extremely distorted. He interrupted the sports segment on the 9 o'clock news for about 25 seconds, and then a few hours later he interrupted a broadcast of Doctor Who for about 90 seconds. The whole thing was very weird, and the second interruption featured some fairly inappropriate behavior, such as the moment when he partially exposed his butt, and an unidentified woman came into the shot and began smacking his butt with a fly swatter. I'm unsure why someone would hijack a television broadcast for absolute nonsense, but I guess maybe he was just trying to have a good time. While the charges for this incident could have left the man with jail time and a $100,000 fine, no one has been able to figure out who this man was or even the woman who helped him are. I wonder if we'll ever get answers because I have so many questions. This would be such a good deathbed confession. I'm just saying, if you're out there watching this, please. In our number 1 spot today, we have the government spy. For this one, we are taking a bit of a turn and talking about someone who used secret signals and transmissions in order to spy on the US for Cuba, and no, they did not stay anonymous, of course. Ana Montez is a former American senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and for 17 years she used encrypted messages to receive information and communicate with the Cuban government in order to spy on the United States. In the charging documents, American federal prosecutors said, quote, Montez communicated with the Cuban intelligence service through encrypted messages and received her instructions through shortwave encrypted transmissions from Cuba. In addition, Montez communicated by coded numeric pager messages with the Cuban intelligence service by public telephones located in the District of Columbia and Maryland. The codes included "I received message" or "danger." Ana was arrested by the FBI at her office on September 21st, 2001, and part of the reason why is because she apparently had classified information on the US military's pending invasion of Afghanistan, and people were worried that she might go on to further reveal this information. While Ana pleaded guilty to her crimes, which could have even carried a death sentence, she received 25 years, and her tentative release date is actually January 8th, 2023. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye!